Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, the ABMI and LiDAR, remote sensing methods to map vegetation regeneration on human footprint. Before we begin, I'd just like to share a land acknowledgement. The ABMI respectfully acknowledges that our work takes place on the territories of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, traditional and ancestral lands of First Nations and Métis people, whose histories, languages, and cultures are directly connected to the biodiversity that we monitor. We acknowledge the traditional teachings of the lands that we work on, and that reciprocal, meaningful, and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples make our work possible. And now, a bit about our presenter today, Branko Hricko. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. With over 2 decades of experience, Branko began his career in academia, spending 6 years building his expertise in photogrammetry and remote sensing. Branko then transitioned into private consulting for 11 years, where he applied these skills in various geospatial projects. Currently, he is continuing his career at the ABMI, lucky for us, leveraging his specialized knowledge to support impactful environmental and geospatial initiatives. So take it away, Branko.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you everyone for coming in here. My name is Branko. I've been with ABMI for 10 years now, over 10 years actually. 8 of those I've been part of Human Footprint Mapping Group. Last 2 years, I've been helping out with LiDAR and aerial data acquisition.
No.
Excuse me?
Sorry, someone is... Oh, I'll mute you. There's a few people who are not quite muted.
All right.
Sorry, Branko, go ahead.
No worries. All right, and today's I prepare a presentation to demonstrate how are we using LiDAR for mapping vegetation on human footprint. Agenda is very simple. I'll have a little bit of intro, then I'll go dive into methods, but it's going to be just a heads up on a high level. If there are any technical questions about methodologies and codes and so on, I'm more than happy to answer at the end of the meeting. And then I will follow up with some showcases where I'll demonstrate different types of vegetations and how we can use LiDAR to map those. All right, so what are we mapping? As I mentioned, we are mapping vegetation on human footprint, including seismic lines. And I felt that it's kind of important to kind of highlight that seismic lines because those are quite specific type of human footprints. It is part of human footprint, but quite challenging to actually map. We are focusing our mapping on vegetation, status, meaning structure, composition, so heights, canopy closure, and so on. And our challenge is quite obvious. We don't want to send a lot of field work into the field. We want to accomplish our goal by remote sensing techniques. As I mentioned, I've been part of a human footprint group for a while, and we have developed what I would call kind of flagship data set of ABMI, at least in a geospatial field, and that's human footprint inventory. And human footprint inventory contains a lot of information. It contains information about human footprint, wall to wall. So for entire province, we know a lot about type of the human footprint. There's a whole bunch of database information. So for example, in this snapshot, we can see well abandoned. We know it was clear in 1994. We know it was actually abandoned in 2002. Seismic lines were cleared in 1994. But since we released this data set, and it was 10 years ago in 2014, we've been always asked, whether that's from our users or our stakeholders, what is the status of vegetation? Because status of vegetation on human footprint can significantly influence the result of any analysis that you do. So we actually look at a couple of methods how to provide this information. Initially, we look at NDVI indices from medium resolution satellites as a Sentinel and similar. We actually even venture into point cloud photogrammetry and look at the structure from the point clouds created from photogrammetry. But lately, we've been using LiDAR to accomplish this goal. So when you look at the LiDAR, and I hope many of you are familiar with the LiDAR, the most of the usage of the LiDAR was focused actually on topography, whether that's for creating contours or any engineering processes. But we actually use LiDAR for vegetation. So I don't want to say we really ignore topography, but we really zoom in on vegetation. And in here, you can see canopy height model, and the green colors and yellow and brown colors represent vegetation in a scale. right? And you can see that within polygon, whether that's well site or seismic line, there is indeed a lot of vegetation. So question is, how do we quantify it? Early on, we actually realized that specifically for seismic lines, there is one additional task, and that is that human footprint polygons need to be readjusted to follow the exact corridors on a landscape to map just the areas of the clean clearings, not to report on anything that might have been adjacent to the seismic line. So this task is actually kind of separated into two subtasks. First is a realignment of the seismic lines, and then quantification of vegetation. So that quantification of vegetation, we use algorithm to find locations where we think there is a vegetation, either cluster of the points or individual tree. And then once you have polygons and once you have vegetations, it's just the statistical process to quantify that amount of vegetation, whether that's going to be mean height, maximum height, density, or a canopy closure. Now, for this process, you really have to have high density LiDAR. So this example that I'm showing is on a LiDAR that has been captured in 2023 in area of Bischu, and it has 18 points per square meter. So quite high density. Now, traditionally in a province of Alberta, we have been fortunate enough with a lot of data sets of the LiDAR, but most of them actually were created for engineering purposes where density 1 point per square meter is sufficient. For our analysis, that density is not sufficient. We would like to have densities in between 12 to 16, preferably even more than 16 points per square meter. Therefore, ABMI actually stepped into aerial data acquisition program, started in 2022. We started a little bit later within that season, so area is around 27,000 square meters. But in 2023, we were able to collect more than 40,000 square kilometers. In 2024, we are still processing the data and actually even acquiring the data as we speak. The plan was to get into somewhere around 45,000 square kilometers. We are using high-end LiDAR sensor provided by Teledyne Optics, Galaxy T2000. It is combined with optical sensor phased 150 megapixels, where we can obtain, and we are obtaining 4 bands RGB and quality of the imagery. Now, let's have a look at this example. We have higher resolution orthophoto, and when we display human footprint polygons on this orthophoto, and maybe it's going to be better to display on canopy height models, you can see that center lines of these polygons are very close to the edge of the corridors. And this is perfectly fine for human footprint inventory, because main mandate of ABMI is actually report on whether it's area or length or density of human footprint, and this would be sufficient. But if we would create corridors directly from these center lines as they are coming from HFI, we would be actually over-reporting of vegetation, because most of the, or on some of the seismic lines, most of the report would be actually from the adjacent forest. So the first task, as I mentioned, was that realignment of center lines, and then calculating proper width of the corridor, so we can create polygons that are realigned with actual clearing. And the next step is to calculate location and height of individual vegetation clusters. It is not equal to the stems. In some cases, it could be very similar, but really we are calling it as a stem of the as a clusters of the vegetations, just to capture even areas with shrubs and low vegetation that do not have formed that stem just yet. And for that, we developed in-house semi-automated workflow based on machine learning modeling. But what is important, we follow it up with human edits and quality control, meaning we run the model creates a lot of data. Those data are, partially included some noise. We have to look at that noise, clean it up. So we have group of trained interpreters looking at the data and doing that quality control and clean up the data after modeling. And then for individual tree detection, we use open source automated workflow developed by LiDAR R within a library of R. And I felt that it's necessary to dedicate at least one slide to properly cite the source of the LiDAR R. Just as a side note, I really like this approach. And for anyone who would have an ambition to look at the processing of the LiDAR, this would be library within the R that I would recommend. Okay, back to our modeling. Let's have a look at a typical derived product from the LiDAR. So this is area of Little Smoky. We flew it in 2022 with density of 22 points per square meter. One of the most typical outcome from the LiDAR is bare earth DEM, used, as I said, for engineering purposes, for topography, and you essentially remove entire vegetation and structure above the terrain. We use also canopy height model. So canopy height model, on the contrary, pretty much ignores through the process of normalization topography and models vegetation. In this snapshot, the darker green represents taller vegetation and lighter green represents a smaller vegetation, so smaller heights. We adopted quite extensively canopy closure estimate values. And for everyone who's more interested about description of these values, I would recommend document created by USDA Forest Service for the Fusion software, where this document describes how this value is calculated, but essentially what it is, it mathematically calculates canopy cover based on the ratio in between number of the points returned by vegetation above the threshold to total return. So in short, the brighter areas closer to 100% would represent very dense canopies. Areas on this snapshot that are represented by dark and black color represent there is no vegetation at all. So this is the ratio in between 0 to 100. We also use within our workflow a data set that is created from recalculating intensity of the signal return. And, in short, different land covers returns the signal that has been emitted from the sensor with a different intensity. And you can include this intensity rate into your modeling. And you can see quite clearly that materials, targets, or land cover, let's say on the road, have a different intensity of return as within the vegetation. So where is the forest? So we can include this as one of your inputs into your modeling. Now let's have a look at a couple of showcases. This is one of the typical challenge that any interpreter must overcome in order to try to quantify vegetation on seismic lines. As I mentioned, seismic lines are quite specific type of human footprint. They are usually very narrow corridors, very long corridors. And when you look at high resolution imagery, in this case, you can see, or you actually cannot see a very much information underneath the canopies there within the corridor. It's obstructed by shadows, and sometimes it is obstructed by adjacent forest. Now, when you look at canopy height model, that problem goes away, because right now you do not have shadow information included and you do not have overhanging information there. This canopy height model is displayed with a little bit different color scheme, but again, darker shades or darker color represents no vegetation. Bright yellow colors, that's the tallest vegetation. So we can see that there is a lot of vegetation actually within this intersection of seismic lines. We can quantify this vegetation in forms of points with location where we predict there is either individual tree or cluster of vegetation. For each point, I'm not sure if you can see actually that a red highlighter, so I'll just put cursor on top of it. We can see location in coordinates X and Y, and also Z coordinate, which is not coordinated, but it's actually representing height of that vegetation. And on the 3D plot, you can see that indeed within this intersection, there is a lot of vegetation underneath the canopy or within the corridors that would be really difficult to interpret either from 2D imagery or from 3D imagery. From LiDAR imagery, that information is quite obvious. The second example I want to show you is the harvest area that has been cleared in 1999. We collected LiDAR for this area in 22, so it's approximately 20 years old planted forest. There, it is on a quite flat topography, but when we zoom closer, you can actually see on a canopy height model rows of the vegetation that were planted those 20 years ago. And you can see that there's a lot of coniferous with some deciduous trees, probably most likely combination of pines and poplars or aspens. So we can zoom even a little bit closer, and you can, on high resolution imagery, you can clearly see these individual trees. Now in canopy height model, you actually see those individual trees as well, right? Without any kind of further analysis, you could pick up a center of these points. So we run that individual tree detection algorithm, and those points are detected. And what we have on top of that, we have height for each and every point. So we can generate this, and again, in a 3D plot on the left side, you can see that indeed the uniformity of that planted harvest area and similarity of those crown shapes allow to this individual tree detection program or model to be run efficiently. Now, in another example, we have seismic line. It is situated just a little bit north of that harvest area. And on the seismic line, I'll just zoom it a little bit closer, we can see vegetation growing as well, right? But it's naturally occurring. It hasn't been planted, so it's probably a mixture of the trees, and quality of the LiDAR points is a little bit different. When we look at canopy height model, there is not much of signs of vegetation directly on the seismic line, although algorithm itself can pick up some points that are considered to be individual trees or individual clusters of the shrubs. When we look at 3D model or 3D plot on the left side, you can see the density of those points of the vegetation and geometrical shape of those cluster points. It is a little bit different than on previous example. So the outcome from this is that we still can detect clusters of the vegetation, but it is a little bit more challenging. But algorithm works well even in these situations that are less typical for more mature regeneration process. Let's just have a look at a couple of other examples on how LiDAR could be utilized for human footprint purposes. So in this snapshot, we have high resolution color imagery, and I would kind of assume that even for a trained individual, it would be really difficult to figure out whether at any point in time there was any human footprint created within this snapshot. But when we look at canopy height models, you can clearly recognize structure of vegetation within this rectangle adjacent to this riparian area that has been changed. So density and height of these trees is completely different. Now, when we look at bare earth VEM, that's actually our clue where we can see that there was a forestry road created, probably connecting to the seismic lines. And there was actually harvest area created and cleared in 1991. So in this case, that canopy height model and a bare earth model could lead directly to the clues to identify human footprint that otherwise would be completely hidden. In this example, we have very similar situation. Again, untrained professional, even trained professional, I don't really, to be honest, I don't really see any human footprint in here. When I look at canopy height model, I can see some patterns forming in the canopy height model. We brought into this situation a little bit help from ortho photos that we created from provincial archives of government of Alberta, from the mapping that had been completed in 1980s. So in the 1980s imagery, we can see, yeah, in fact, within this area, we have 3 seismic lines created in north-south directions. And we can actually see on the bare earth, again, that change micro topography with clear identification or clear indication that seismic lines indeed have been created there. Now, the nice part about our process is that at the end, when you create polygon representing the seismic line, and when you create polygon representing the reference area, so you can shift the same polygon, copy and paste simply into, I don't know, 25 meters deep into the forest, 50 meters, it depends on the type of analysis that you are running, then you can calculate these values as a canopy closure, heights, and any statistic, height-related statistic. And you can mathematically compare the performance of vegetation on human footprint and outside of the human footprint in the reference area. And in this example, at human footprint, canopy closure is actually higher than on reference areas, and even maximum height, it's pretty close, but mean height, it's a little bit overperforming the reference area. So I guess the biggest outcome from this slide and from this presentation that we are removing any guessing work, any subjectivity, any bias of interpreters by mathematically or statistically derived values, and those values are telling us the state of the vegetation comparing to the reference areas. Yeah, these seismic lines were clear in 1980s. On this example, I just want to show you that not only on human footprint, the LiDAR analysis could be applied, but even for areas outside of the human footprint. So let's say with this habitat of, wetland development habitat of beaver, you can see that on bare earth, it's clear really from microtopography that you can see these different cascades of beaver dams. And on canopy height models, you can see that, yeah, probably these beavers are quite active. There is not much tall vegetation left, and there is all shrubby. And even from intensity analysis, you can see that intensity of the return could be clearly used as a source of either classification or training, where you have different intensities returned by grassy areas to different intensity of the return as a result of shrubby or little bit woody areas. Now, I'm not the biologist, but I think that this could be really utilized in other fields, not only in human footprint. And what's interesting in here, even area of water, it returned a lot of kind of different pattern of intensities, probably depending on vegetation within the lake itself. Within this example, I want to show you a seismic line that was created in 1980s on a wetland. And this is 1980s orthophoto. You can clearly see that it was existing in 1980s, this east-west seismic line. And on DEM, bare earth DEM, you can see that microtopography reveals actually pattern of the seismic lines within this area. And canopy height model shows that there is a lot of growth directly on a seismic line, on a human footprint, and it's clearly outperforms the reference areas, right? So we can actually talk about some sort of inverse effect of human footprint on vegetation in this case. And this inverse effect is visible sometimes on a polygonal type of human footprint as well. If you look at this well path constructed within a wetland area, and you display microtopography of bare earth, you can see that there is a lot of changes in the microtopography, resulting in very different growth of vegetation on human footprint compared to reference area. What is interesting about this case that this is actually still in a category of active well sites. And again, we know based on HFI that it has been cleared in 1987, and last production date was actually in 2002. Now, if you are interested in our LiDAR datasets, ABMI is releasing publicly datasets in form of derived products. So those derived products would include bare earth digital elevation model, canopy height model, canopy cover estimates, and mean intensity of returns. And we included a couple of others products as well that we use for modeling purposes, but they are available for download. And three tops that would be vector file representing the model vegetation locations with the heights. If you just go into abmi.ca and you look for data download, then you can find that source of LiDAR dataset, or I'm sure we are going to copy and paste this summer into our presentation, or into email that we are going to be sending back to all the presenters. And that's all what I had. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.